What is a shapeshifter, and are shapeshifters merely a legend, or are they something real? What kinds of shapeshifter sightings have been reported over the years, and what are some of the most frequent types of sightings? Is shapeshifting simply a physical transformation, or is there possibly a mental projection aspect to it? Are extraterrestrials shapeshifters, and if so, are they simply performing some type of magic act on us? Distinguished author, paranormal investigator, and speaker John Kachuba joins me to talk about shapeshifting and about some of his experiences in the paranormal on this episode of Passion for the Paranormal. Well, greetings, fellow truth seekers, and welcome once again to Passion for the Paranormal, bringing a passion for the paranormal to you. I'm your host, Curry Stegan, and as always, it's really good to be back here again with you, and it's great to have John Kachuba joining me. And it's really good to be covering a topic that I've never covered on the show before as a main topic, and that is the topic of shapeshifting. As you know me and you've listened to the show for a while, I really enjoy covering new topics, and so I'm excited to cover this one with John. John has a lot of experience in the paranormal and has researched and written a book about shapeshifting, so really looking forward to getting to this discussion with him. If you haven't visited us on the website, you can visit us at passion4theparanormal.com, at Facebook, facebook.com/passion4theparanormal, and know a friend, family member, coworker that you think might enjoy checking out the show. Just simply share a link with them, let them know about it, and do another thing. Simply hit that subscribe button on whatever podcast app you're using out there, and you will get notified when new episodes drop. Okay, really eager and excited to get into the discussion with John on shapeshifting and in his experiences in the paranormal. I really hope you're going to enjoy tonight's show, and thank you so much for tuning into the show. Okay, so joining me tonight is John Kachuba, and John is a distinguished author, paranormal investigator, and speaker. And John has investigated over 80 haunted locations and has written several paranormal-themed books. He is a regular guest on radio and television shows and has also spoken at paranormal conferences. John teaches creative writing at Ohio University and currently resides in Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati is a town some consider to be one of the most haunted towns in America. John, thank you so much for joining me on the show tonight.
Thank you, Curry. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to talk with you. And John, can you talk a little bit about, you reside in Cincinnati. Why is it that people consider Cincinnati to be such a haunted location?
You know, I hear this all the time about what city is the most haunted, and Cincinnati is my hometown, so I would like to think that it is. I think part of the reason why people think Cincinnati is so uniquely haunted is because of some of the locations that we have that are kind of unusual, like Cincinnati Music Hall, which is a very famous place, which is haunted. We have an observatory, an astronomical observatory that supposedly has a ghost. And I don't know of any other city that has an observatory that's got a ghost in it. So I think it's the range of types of places that we have that makes it something special.
I have heard of Music Hall, Cincinnati, and in fact, I think the Ghost Hunters did an episode there quite a while back, and they seem to have some kind of interesting findings on the show. And let's step back and hear how this journey all started for you. How, first of all, did you get into investigating the paranormal and ultimately writing paranormal-themed books?
Sure. Well, I grew up in New England, and I've always been a lover of history. And growing up in that area, you hear all the old stories, you hear all the true stories, the true history, but then you also hear the legends, you hear the ghost stories, the tales of the indigenous people there, all those kinds of stories, which really just appealed to me in a big way. And I was in a location in Connecticut called Dudleytown, sometimes called Dark Entry. And I was there not for paranormal reasons. I was just there for, I was interested in the history of the place. It was a little town that was built on a mountain in Connecticut back in the 18th century. And within a matter of maybe a generation, several of the inhabitants went insane. And eventually the town just fell into ruin and people left it, and it became became an abandoned, supposedly haunted town. But I went up there because I was just fascinated with the history. And I took some photos, took a lot of pictures. And in a picture of an abandoned, was a foundation of a house, an old cellar hole. And in that picture, when I looked at it, it looked like there was a face looking at me. My first reaction was, well, yeah, sure, that's leaves and vines and everything else, and my brain is just putting them together to look like a face. So I enlarged the photo a few times. And when I did, it became more defined as a face instead of less defined as a face. So at the time, this was Connecticut, and I was living in Monroe, and that's where Ed and Lorraine Warren also lived. And, they're pretty much known as America's, I would say they're premier ghost hunters, sort of the ones that really put ghost hunting on the map in America. And I just called them out of the blue. They didn't know me, I didn't know them, but I just said, look, I've got these pictures from Dudleytown, and they're really strange. I'd be, possible for you to take a look at them. And they invited me to their home. They were very gracious. They said, come down and we'll take a look. And they did. I went to their house. They took a look at them, and they immediately said, oh, yeah, you've got some anomalies there from Dudleytown. And then they proceeded to open up the scrapbook and show me all their photos from Dudleytown over the years. And there was hundreds with all these anomalies. So that really piqued my interest in the paranormal. Like, wow, there's really some things going on here. And it tied in very nicely with my love of history. And I had been writing pretty much all my life, but it wasn't until I had started investigating as a result of the Warrens and getting me interested in this. Years after starting my investigations, I eventually got around to writing some of them down, and 5 or 6 books later on ghost hunting, here we are.
Yeah, that's interesting. The connection with the Warrens, that certainly could pique anybody's interest, I would think, in the paranormal, having that kind of interaction with them. Let's talk a little bit about, now you've also written books. Well, I shouldn't say books. I think one book now on shapeshifters, and that's a kind of a history of shapeshifting, and which is a fascinating topic to me. And I've never really covered much of it other than perhaps the skinwalker. A brief mention of skinwalkers on Skinwalker Ranch here, which is right here in northeastern Utah. But what kind of prompted you to go in that direction and to write about the shapeshifters?
A couple of things got me there. The first thing is I've always been a believer in personal transformation. And I don't mean by that, physically changing into something else, but I believe that we all, over our lifetime, at different times we are different people. We change our lives, we change our outlooks, we change our behaviors, and so we're automatically kind of always shape-shifting. So and I've always been interested in that from the sense of, from kind of a spiritual point of view, like what does that mean for us as people, and how do we deal with ourselves, what do we think about ourselves if we're constantly sort of in a state of flux. So that was one thing. What really got me to write the book, though, was that I do a lot of public speaking about ghosts and the paranormal. And as many times as I do these in libraries and universities, people will tell me they're ghost stories. And every so often I'll hear a story from somebody, and I'll say, that doesn't sound like a ghost. And they'll say, well, it was kind of a ghost, but then it kind of morphed into something else. And what I thought I was hearing more often than not were stories that sounded like they were talking about shapeshifters, whether that's how they identified them or not. That's what they sounded like to me. So I just started investigating the whole idea of the shapeshifter. And the book, Shapeshifters, A History, came out in 2019, so it is my most recent book, and it is the first one about shapeshifters. It also was a finalist for the Bram Stoker Award in nonfiction, so I'm pretty proud of that. But what I found out, Curry, in doing this was that almost every culture around the world has some kind of a shapeshifter character in it, if not one, several maybe. And not only were the shapeshifter characters appearing like in their mythology or their religious beliefs, but in many cultures they appeared in reality, in the sense that people in that culture believed genuinely that there were shapeshifters among them, that you could shapeshift, that certain people could shapeshift. So it was just a fascinating account. So I looked at the shapeshifter from the earliest mention. Well, it wouldn't even be mentioned because it was prehistoric. There's a cave painting in France that dates back from the Neolithic period, and I have a drawing of it in my book, and what it clearly shows is sort of a deer on its hind legs, but it has fingers and toes instead of hooves, and it's got eyes that are forward instead of the side of the head like a deer. And anthropologists say that this is the first representation of somebody transforming from a human into a deer. And they believe basically it was probably the depiction of a shaman who was doing that kind of stuff for hunters that would go out and then catch the deer because they or kill the deer because they believed they had shifted into deers. It's just a fascinating account. And so I look at the history of them. I look at the psychology involved, and why are we so fascinated with the shapeshifter figure? And I look at a lot of the standard ones too. You mentioned the skinwalker. I talk about skinwalkers. I talk about wendigos, which are also from the indigenous population here in North America, and they are also shapeshifters. But then, some of the typical ones that everybody knows, the werewolf, of course, vampires, but just there's hundreds of types, hundreds. I did research for this I was in 7 countries in Europe, including places like Belarus, Ukraine, Romania, so I really got into locations where there was a lot of shapeshifter lore and history and, legend and all that kind of stuff. It was a fascinating book to write.
Yeah, and I guess what I would ask is, so you kind of went on this journey of delving into the paranormal, and sometimes it has kind of this effect on some of us, and I know it did for me, and kind of opening up and expanding your horizons, if you will, into other areas of perhaps unexplained phenomena. I'm wondering if that's kind of what happened to you. Sounds like this is your most recent book. Did starting to delve into the paranormal ultimately lead you kind of in this direction, or talk about how that kind of happened?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that's what happened. Just starting off with ghosts, that made me start thinking that, there might be more to the universe, to the multiverse, than I know about.
Sure.
And some of the beliefs that I had, maybe there's room for other beliefs and other theories and other possibilities as to what's around us, what our multiverse is like, what we're like. So yeah, the whole thing about the ghosts just opened up for me a couple of things. Kind of ask some spiritual questions, like what does it mean to be a ghost? Is there if there's a ghost and there's some kind of a afterlife, what's that like? And I don't look at it necessarily from a religious point of view, but I'm thinking, okay, is it possible if we accept that there's ghosts, then we're accepting that there's a whole nother realm? And then you start looking at quantum physics, and you start looking at multiple dimensions and multiple realities all occurring at the same time, simultaneously, infinite number. So it just drives you crazy. And yeah, it leads me to other areas that I wouldn't have thought of. Like, I don't think that I really would have necessarily just gone out and said, I'm going to look at shapeshifters if I hadn't started off with the ghost thing. And I don't know where I'll go from here. There could be more about shapeshifters. This could be leading me to some other area, too, that I'm not even aware of just yet.
Sure. Now, when you first came into it, well, let me back up for just a sec. Let's talk about kind of your idea of what a shapeshifter is. Is it something physical? Is it something kind of a mental projection of something? Kind of give us your idea of what a shapeshifter is.
So I have a couple of different explanations for that, or different beliefs, I should say. One is I find it difficult to believe that somebody could turn into a wolf, to suddenly sprout hair and fangs and claws and all that, and run around and attack people and everything else. To me, that kind of shapeshifter, that story to me is more legend, more metaphor. which doesn't, I guess, doesn't address all the numbers of actual sightings that people have had where they said, well, I've seen shapeshifters, so I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah.
But to me, what I think is the big thing is I think shapeshifters are more internal in that it's a mental thing. There's a guy here in Ohio his name is Guy Savelli. And I don't know if that name means anything to you or not, but he's a martial arts expert in a pretty rare form of Taekwondo. And he also has worked with like Navy SEALs and special ops guys in the military. And there was a movie that came out, or a book first. The title I might mess up, but it's Men That Stare at Goats or Men That Look at Goats. And the idea was doing mind projection to either do remote viewing, or in Guy's case, they tested him and he was able to knock down a goat from 50 yards away while he was in a room where he couldn't even see the goat, and he did it supposedly by just mind projection. Well, Guy is an example to me of a person who you might want to consider a shapeshifter. And the reason why I say that is I got a story from one of his students, one of his martial arts students. And the student told me that he and Guy were in a bar someplace. They're just minding their own business, and somebody came up to them. The guy that came up to him was drunk, and he was belligerent, and he got in Savelli's face and just started, yelling at him and all this kind of stuff. And the student said, I was watching Guy, and he just stood there. He didn't do anything. He said, but all of a sudden, his face, he said, I don't know how to describe it. He said his face sort of changed. And next thing you know, this drunk guy, his eyes open wide, and his face just gets white, and he just backs off. He literally walks backwards, walks away, and says, okay, and he leaves. And so the student said that what I saw on Savelli, he said, I don't know how to explain it other than I saw a tiger. Well, there was no tiger there. I mean, Savelli did not turn into a tiger, but somehow he's able to mentally project that image, and to me, that's a shapeshifter. I mean, that's another way, and I believe that happens more than we believe. And so when people say that, oh yeah, I saw this guy, and next thing I know, he turned into a wolf. Well, maybe that's what you saw, and maybe this person has that ability to somehow project that image, or it's almost like mind control, make you think you're seeing something you don't see. It's like magic in a sense. That's what a magician does, right? You see things that you're not really seeing. You're not really, what you're seeing isn't really happening, I guess is the way to put it.
Right.
So to me, that's more, I believe that is probably maybe the explanation for a lot of shape-shifting activities, or what we consider to be shapeshifters.
Yeah, so I'm assuming you looked into the Dracula vampire phenomena, into werewolves, and what if you did, what did you kind of uncover when it comes to that side of it?
Well, so you're right, I did. In France, I spent a lot of time researching in the area of Gévaudan, which is where in the 18th century there was something that people were calling the beast. That's all they can call it, the beast. And they described it as this huge canine kind of animal that over the course of about 18 months did kill about 100 people in these small villages in France. And to this day, nobody really knows what it was. But there was a lot of reports from France and from Germany, like in the 17th century, 16th century, of werewolf attacks. And what it turned out was that a lot of these werewolves were not werewolves at all, but they were people that were suffering from lycanthropy, which is, it's a mental illness in which people think that they are wolves. And they don't just think that they're wolves. I mean, they act out as wolves. So there was a famous case in Germany. I think the guy's name was Peter Struble from the 1600s. I don't recall the exact date. But he literally attacked people. He attacked like 3 or 4 people and killed them with his bare hands. I mean, just tore them apart and started eating them. So, you have this. I mean, is that a werewolf? Is that a real transformation? No. But it certainly has that activity of being like a werewolf. And you can understand where people, before they understood the science and before they understood medicine and everything else like we do now in mental illness, would say, well, yeah, I mean, it's a werewolf. He's possessed. The devil possessed him and turned him into a werewolf. So you have that account. Vampires, I did the Dracula. I did the whole Dracula bit in Romania, where I went to the house where Vlad Tepes was born, and Vlad Tepes was a prince, 16th century prince, who people think Bram Stoker may have modeled his Count Dracula on this prince, because he was a pretty ruthless prince. He would impale his enemies, military enemies, political enemies, by the thousands. And so he got kind of reputation as being a bloodthirsty guy, and people thought he was a vampire, mainly because of that. But there's obviously no evidence to that effect at all. But the Romanians have a very strange notion about vampires. There are many that actually believe that, yeah, there are vampires. And then there's another half that just says, it's total superstition. So it's a mixed bag with that.
Yeah, getting back to Vlad, he actually was coined the name Vlad the Impaler. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. That was the name to give to him. Right.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Ruthless by some people's accounts. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other areas you delved into shapeshifting. Did you get into some of the other kinds of lores out there, legends, if you will? What are some of the other areas you kind of tackled in the book?
Well, I didn't so much as find any evidence or any research on this one, but I did talk about the what many people today believe are reptilian alien shapeshifters that are among us, and this whole thing goes back to David Icke in England, who came up with this story about some type of alien race that came to our planet millions of years ago, much more advanced than us, came to us millions of years ago, and they were reptilian and able to change their shape, that they came to Earth, and that they mated with the proto-humans that were running around on the planet at that point, probably half ape, half human. I don't know what they would have been, but early ancestors of ours. And so by doing that, they created this strain in the DNA that still has this reptilian alien gene, if you will. I mean, I'm really dumbing it down because I don't think that Ike has much detail in it either. But the idea is that these creatures are still among us today, millions of years later, and that they have many of them taken over positions of power. And so some of them that, according to Ike, were reptilian alien shapeshifters were like Queen Elizabeth II, the late queen, was supposed to have been one. Barack Obama was supposed to have been one. And he's got a lot of political figures that he mentions, as well as other celebrities from the sports world, from entertainment, and apparently, according to his story, there is some plan to take over the world. It's called I think he calls it the Babylonian conspiracy or Babylon conspiracy. And it's got something to do with the reptilian aliens are the ones that are going to be taking over the world. To which I say, well, it's taken them millions of years. They haven't done it yet, so they need to up their game a little bit if that's going to happen.
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting that you actually do go into the extraterrestrial kind of direction with it as well. There's a lot of this kind of brings into play perhaps mental projection or the ability to make people see what you want them to see, perhaps. And when it comes to the, I cover all things unexplained on this show. So, I've had many UFO authors, researchers, people who have done research into alien abductions. And there's a lot of talk about people who have been abducted, especially when you start dealing with children, where there's this image projected upon them of perhaps something that could be a little bit more palatable for them to accept seeing, whether it be some sort of, I had one gentleman who is an abductee who said, they appeared to him as these kind of almost like a small monkey type creature to him in his room. And perhaps that's the image they wanted him to see because, some say maybe they're just not ready to see these things as they really are. So perhaps they possess the ability to make people see what they want to see. And so I think this is a real interesting aspect of perhaps shape-shifting. And when you get into the, again, getting back to alien abductions, a lot of people have seen, things like owls and even deer, other types of animals, or as children, they see something that is perhaps a little bit easier for them to stomach or see, and then they have some sort of strange abduction experience. But what say you about the alien abduction phenomena? Have you delved into any of that, and how that may pertain to shapeshifting?
No, I haven't with alien abduction per se, but I do have somebody in my book, and I can't remember his name, unfortunately, who writes about pretty much what you were just talking about, where his theory is that aliens would have been among us and continue to be among us, but that for the most part we don't recognize them because if we saw them in their true form, we'd be terrorized, we'd be, whatever, or just totally confused, or whatever it might be. And so by necessity, he said, they change to mimic sort of what they're looking at. So if they're if they appear before a child, there's a good chance that they may appear as another child to a child, so that the child's not looking at something unusual or something you couldn't stomach, or, and if they're appearing to, Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert, that they might do the same thing. It might just look like a Bushman. And then, maybe they have certain powers or something where people might say, well, how do you do that? So there is that whole thing about sort of how aliens, if they're among us, could very well be shapeshifters. And the interesting thing is, if you go back to the shapeshifter thing, again, going back thousands of years, if you go back to like the Greek and Roman mythologies, let's take Zeus, for instance. Zeus was a master shapeshifter. I mean, he shapeshifted into at least 15 different forms, according to Ovid and his Metamorphosis. And I go through this in the book too. But the interesting thing is why he does that. For one thing, every time he does that, he has his way with some woman. So he's terrible at getting dates on his own, so he has to shapeshift, right? But the truth is, the reason why he does that is because no mortal would ever be able to view him in his true divine form, his true celestial form. It'd be too much. It'd be too overwhelming. The person would die. So if he wanted to have any kind of interaction with humans of any kind, he would have to shapeshift into either another human being or an animal or something that's familiar to humans, which is what you just talked about. But it's interesting because this is in the mythology of, thousands of years ago. So what did the Greeks and Romans know thousands of years ago that we passed off as kind of fairy tales? But were they onto something themselves? Were they talking about aliens? And is that how aliens still work today if they're among us? And if they're among us doing that, then the Greeks and Romans thousands of years ago were way ahead of us.
It certainly is interesting to kind of think of it from that perspective. Let's talk about the paranormal now. You have had conversation and met with the Warrens, and which is quite interesting because they actually, and had written a book about some of the demonic cases that they had investigated. And this kind of is an interesting aspect of it. You could say, based on some of the accounts out there, that there has been shape-shifting that has happened in some of these demonic possession cases. Have you looked into that? Did you cover that in the book? And what kind of say you about demonic possession and people changing form, whether it's their eyes change colors, they levitate, that sort of thing.
Right. Well, I have to say that the Warrens and I look at things a little bit differently. They were very strict Catholics, and for them, the whole sort of paranormal thing. I'm speaking for them. Of course, they're both deceased at this point, but it was like God versus the devil, and so they talked about demonic possession and demons being among us and everything else. And I didn't particularly buy into that, because my thought is that if ghosts exist, and if they are simply the remnants or the energy or the soul or the spirit, whatever you want to call it, of all of us, the one thing that might be eternal, that might go on into some other form, then why would they be demonic? I mean, my grandfather was a nice guy, so he's deceased. If he was a ghost, I can't imagine he'd come back as a demon. I mean, he'd come back as my grandfather, still a nice guy. What would have changed him in that other realm that he becomes demonic? Which is not to say that there isn't evil in the world, and that there might not be, spirits with evil intent. I'm not sure I'd want to meet the ghost of, Saddam Hussein or Idi Amin or Stalin or Hitler.
Right.
Because I have a feeling those would be pretty nasty spirits. I guess what I'm saying is I think whatever you are in life is whatever you're going to be in the afterlife. If you're good, you're good. If you're bad, you're bad. So to that point, but the Warrens talked about demons as being, eternal creatures that were, for the most part, never human. They were never incarnate. They were just spirit all the time. And the devil, I mean, that's what they're talking about.
Perhaps fallen angels.
Yeah, right. And I don't buy into that theology. It's a personal thing, but I don't.
Yeah, and I've certainly, I'm also a paranormal investigator, been doing it for a number of years, and I've never came across it myself either, and it sounds like you haven't in the course of your dealings either. Is that correct?
No, actually I have not. And even, so a lot of the times that I'm doing investigations, I'll team up with some, depending on where we are, some local group or something, go up, because they have all the equipment and all, which I don't usually have. So, and talking to all these people and going to conferences and everything else, I rarely hear about people having demonic experiences. So I'm not saying that they have, that it's never happened to anybody, but it doesn't seem to be a very common thing, which goes back then to my belief that we're not really talking about a ghost. We're talking about something else. If you believe in devils and angels, then that's what you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, let's talk more, kind of from a paranormal sense, talking about ghosts, and I've covered things like near-death experiences, spiritual visitations, perhaps spiritual visitations from deceased loved ones, and if you think of it this way, some have claimed either through dreams or they've had near-death experiences, have been visited by their deceased loved ones, and they appear to them, as their younger selves. Perhaps maybe they died at a very old age, in their 80s. But when they see them, they appear to be in their 30s or 40s or kind of in the prime of their life. So perhaps this kind of spiritual, visitation, perhaps that's a form of, you could say that's a form of shape-shifting as well.
Well, yeah, I think it could be, and I have an interesting theory about that in terms of relatives visiting, especially in that I think it's possible that when somebody passes away that's close to us, family member, good friend, whatever, we all go through a mourning period, right? I mean, we grieve the loss, we feel the pain, and we miss that person, and so. If somebody, your Uncle Charlie, who you're very close to, passes away, and you're in mourning, and a couple of months later you walk into Uncle Charlie's house because you want to clean it up or whatever, and you walk in and there's Uncle Charlie sitting in his favorite chair smoking his favorite pipe. And he looks at you and kind of smiles, and then he disappears. And I hear this kind of stuff all the time, like these, I'll call them visitations from people, loved ones that have passed on. And I always say, so what is that? Earlier we talked about mental projections and everything else. So do you mentally project that image? Is it, do you miss Uncle Charlie so much that under the right circumstances, your brain just says, that's him, there he is, he's sitting there. And then a couple of seconds and it's gone. So are you mentally creating that? And then the second part of that is, if you are mentally creating that image, are you creating more than the image? Have you actually created Uncle Charlie in spirit? There's some of monks in Nepal have for years and years meditated on a particular object. They'll have an object in mind, never saw it before. They'll create an object in their mind, and they'll just meditate on it for a long time, for years. And then supposedly, at some point, they will bring that object into reality. It'll be there in flesh and blood, solid, in front of them. And they call that a tulpa. Well, if that's possible, if our brain can really do that, or some brains can really do that, then the question might be, are we creating the ghost to begin with?
Right. That's an interesting kind of take on it. I wanted to talk a little bit about cryptids, Bigfoot, other types of cryptids that people report about seeing. There are some out there that believe these are actually perhaps some sort of supernatural entities. I know that some of the Native Americans believe that Bigfoot was a kind of a shape-shifting or supernatural type of entity and not just a flesh and blood creature. Did you delve into any aspect of cryptids as you were going through and researching and writing about the shapeshifters?
Not really, because like to your point, I had heard, especially with Sasquatch and Bigfoot, that some indigenous people think, well, that might be a shapeshifter. But I know a lot of guys that are cryptid hunters and investigators, and I of the mind that all these cryptids that we talk about, right here in Ohio, we have something called the Ohio Grassman, which is very much like Bigfoot. We also have the Loveland frog, which is some kind of an amphibious thing. And what I think about all these is that I don't think they're shapeshifters. I don't think they're alien. I simply think that there's some species that, we just, for whatever reason, have been able to elude mankind for the most part and, been able to hide out, and we're just not finding them. I mean, when was it, back in the 1950s or something, when they pulled up a coelacanth from the ocean off Africa? And that was a fish that was supposed to have been extinct millions of years ago, and nope, there it is. So, I think basically the cryptids that I know about, that I've heard about anyway, to me just seem like, that's an animal that we just haven't had a chance to learn about yet or discover, fully.
Sure. Yeah, John, delving into this book and doing this research on shapeshifters, what surprised you the most, and what did you find the most interesting aspect of it?
Well, I think what surprised me most was, as I said earlier, just the sheer volume of shapeshifters around the world, and how ubiquitous that character is. And so I found that to be amazing. I didn't expect that. And subsequently, as I studied that more, I became really sort of surprised and more interested in the psychological aspect. Like, why is it that there is a shapeshifter in every culture? What do we need from that shapeshifter? What do we get from him? Mentally, psychologically, why are we so attracted to that character? Why is it lasting from the Neolithic times to today, and it's still in popular culture and all? So that was a surprising thing to me. Was just like, what does this mean for us? I'm still asking those questions. So when I said before that who knows, there might be another book on shapeshifters. If there is, I'm telling you, it's going to be more getting into the real psychology of it. Like, what does it say about us that we need to have a shapeshifter character?
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the number of Hollywood movies produced on vampires or werewolves, both shape-shifting type creatures, there's so many of them. I mean, you could go through a list of hundreds of them that are out there, and not just movies, but shows that are produced now. And it does beg the question: why are we so transfixed and so interested in this kind of culture?
Yeah. I think one thing that strikes out to me is, as humans, we have a dual nature, right? I mean, we have our human side, but we also have an animal side. And for the most part, most of us are able to keep that animal part in control, which is a good thing. But you look at the novel, Doctor, totally lost it. The Shapeshifter novel, Doctor Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. When you look at that, Dr. Jekyll, who is this upstanding, moral, doctor who takes care of people, he's kind, he's considerate, et cetera, right down the line. Yet, there's something in his character, in his nature, that says to him, what if I was able to throw off the bonds that hold me in check? The laws, my morality, my religion, my conscience, my sense of guilt. What if I could throw all that off, just do what I wanted to? What would I be? Well, he'd be Mr. Hyde, who is a murderous, no good guy. But I think the shapeshifter sort of does that for us when we indulge in it by watching the movies, reading books, or whatever. It's almost like vicariously sort of throwing off all that and kind of letting yourself go wild, run free, without doing it in any way that hurts anybody or gets you arrested or anything else like that. So I think in some ways the shapeshifter character appeals to us because it may be more something like a psychological pressure relief valve in a way. And this is my theory. I'm not a psychologist. I'm just spitballing here. But it occurs to me that there might be something at play there.
Yeah, perhaps it kind of allows people to maybe perhaps have an escape from
right.
their present reality.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what is Halloween about, and what is cosplay? The cosplayers. I mean, why do we dress up? Why do we pretend that we're some other character for a night? What's that about? It's not to get candy. There's something else. What makes you choose that costume or masquerade that you choose? Why do you choose Superman versus Snoopy? There's got to be a reason for it.
Yeah, and John, did you find out in your research and as you delved into this, were there a lot of people reporting actually seeing shapeshifters and reporting or actually putting out reports about it?
Yeah, there were. I mean, I was getting reports. There was one that I got from an article in the New York Times where it occurred in India, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, and it was from 1990, something like that, 1990, 1991. But like over a period of a month or so, something like 33 children in this area of India went missing. Now, there are wolves in that area, and there have been historically attacks by wolves over that area. But 33 in a short period of time was alarming to the point where villagers started accusing each other of sorcery and witchcraft and abductions, and there was actually a lynch mob. They actually hung some people. So it really got out of hand to the point where the Indian government sent military to Uttar Pradesh to kind of make sure things got quieted down. But the New York Times reporter talked to some of the people who had actually seen what they were calling this. They didn't call it a wolf man. They called it a man wolf. But they described it as being like this, a guy, but like hairy and with claws and like a wolf. And that literally one interviewer or one interviewee said to the reporter, she was like, I think 16 years old or something. She said she saw her 3-year-old little brother carried off by this wolf, or whatever it is. She said it grabbed him and threw him over his shoulder and then ran off on 2 legs. So this is 1990s. There was all these people that were seeing this stuff. There was some cases out of Africa that I report from Yeah, from around the same time period, where there was one in particular where villagers saw some kind of they called it like a giant bat that was hanging in front of somebody's house. And the owner came out and started attacking it like with a bat or a club. He started beating it and almost killed it. And it dragged itself off into the bushes. The villagers followed it. They said that as it dragged itself off, it was metamorphosizing into other things. It changed into, they said, like from a bat to like a pig-type creature. And then eventually the final transformation was an old man who they recognized as like their village shaman. These are reports from newspapers in Africa. There's some from England about werewolves, very old one that's been around for a long time. They call him Old Striker. And as late as, I think, 2007, there were reports of people seeing him jump like 8-foot fence and then run up to the fence as a man and then suddenly leap over it, and on the other side he's a wolf. So there definitely are still stories coming out and still reports, which I said sort of belies what I said before about not being able to explain physical transformations, because there are people that are seeing things like that.
Yeah, now are a lot of those cases just simply dismissed?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess so, because I think of the case in India, where you had 33 children. The army was sent up there, authorities were sent up there to put it down, and then the killings stopped. And they never found anything, so I guess they just say, well, they probably chalk it up to must have been wolves. I think that's what you do. I think if these things go unsolved and become a mystery, it's more comforting to attribute some cause to it, something that is not supernatural. To say, no, it was definitely a wolf. It was absolutely a wolf. You don't want to say it was a wolf that changes to a man that changes back to a wolf again. So I think that's frequently why things are dismissed, because I don't think, especially authorities, I don't think they want to start going down the line of, yeah, it was a supernatural occurrence,
Yeah, John, you had talked about, you did delve in a little bit into talking about skinwalkers, wendigos. Now, as I mentioned, Skinwalker Ranch is really almost my backyard. I mean, that's northeastern Utah. I'm in northern Utah. A lot of strange reports of cryptid-like creatures in the vicinity of Skinwalker Ranch, going all the way back to the Shermans, who were ranching at the property before Robert Bigelow bought the property. All kinds of weird, strange stuff going on. What did you kind of uncover in your research and looking into skinwalkers or wendigos?
Well, I didn't uncover really anything that probably hadn't been talked about already. I did read that somebody wrote that book about the Skinwalker Ranch. I thought that was fantastic. I was reading that. But I found that there were reports of skinwalkers. Mostly the ones I found are from the Dene, the people, the Navajo people, the Four Corners area. And they were talking about sort of seeing something that they were calling either a coyote or maybe a wolf or something along those lines, that you'd be driving along the highway at night or something in a truck doing 80 miles an hour, and you look out the window and there's this thing just loping right along with you doing 80 miles an hour. And so I've heard some stories about those kinds of those things, but those have already been reported. I don't think that I got anything brand new about skinwalkers or the wendigos. The wendigo shapeshifter idea has mostly been legendary from indigenous tribes up in the upper Midwest and up into Canada, like the Cree people and some others like that. But I don't know that there's been any other sort of modern sightings of or experiences with wendigos.
Interesting. Yeah, let's get back to talking about your experience in doing paranormal investigating. Talk about a few of your favorite locations you visited, and maybe a couple of interesting experiences you've had at those locations.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. I think one of them was it's hard to believe it, but there's I mentioned a little bit earlier the Cincinnati Mount Adams Observatory, which is the oldest public observatory in the United States, and it's in Cincinnati. It's so old, the cornerstone for the original building was laid by John Quincy Adams. So we're going back some time. But I had been called to the observatory to check it out, is what the historian said. Just check it out. That was his quote. Because he had heard me on Coast to Coast AM one night, and he had something going on at the observatory, and he wanted me to check it. So he didn't tell me what it was. He just said, just come down and see what you find out. So I went around in the observatory with another guy from Cincinnati who was another paranormal investigator. And the two of us just wandering around, and we didn't detect anything or feel anything. We weren't really doing an investigation. It was more just kind of a walkthrough at first.
Sure.
But anyway, we were doing some research on the building, and what we discovered was that in 1945, there was an astronomer there named Dr. Elliott Smith, who was working in the observatory that night by himself, and he climbed up it's almost like a step ladder that the astronomers used to use to get up to the eyepiece, which was on the telescope mount. It was probably like 8 feet off the ground or so you needed to get up elevated some way. And they used ropes to move the dome, the curtain, as they call it, to different positions in the sky, and also to move the telescope into position. So he climbs up, Elliott Smith climbs up on top of this ladder, he puts the rope around his neck, and he steps off, and he hangs himself. And when I heard that, I said, that can't be true. But then my friend and I did some research, and we found in the New York Times, we found his obituary. He was a famous guy. I mean, this was Cincinnati, and the New York Times was covering his obituary. And they said right there, Dr. Elliott Smith, hanged himself from the telescope in 1945, committing suicide. So when we found that out, we said, we want to do an investigation here. So we spent the night up in the dome where this telescope is located. And it was very cold up there. It was January. There's no heat in the building because heat interferes with the optics. So they just keep it cold. And it was cold. But we sat around. We had our recorders going. Nothing was going on. It was kind of quiet. Then my friend addresses the room like they do on the TV programs. And he said, is there anybody here that wants to make contact? Of course, we didn't hear anything. Then he said, well, I understand there was somebody here that may have killed themselves. And he said, was it Dr. Elliott Smith? Well, again, we don't hear anything. Our recorders are going, but we hear nothing. But then on playback, the next day, as we got us, going through all our photos and our recordings and all that stuff, when we play back, we hear him say, somebody, committed suicide here, and was it Dr. Elliott Smith? And right after that, you hear this whispered, right, just like that, right, R-I-G-H-T. We say, okay, that was very clear, a clear EVP, electronic voice phenomena,
Yes.
And it really did something. But one of the most interesting places I went to was in Florida, and it was a doctor's home and office in the Victorian era, and it's now the Historical Society Museum of Hernando County, Florida, and it's called the May Stringer House. And the house is furnished in all Victorian furniture from the time. And I was called in there because they were saying, the people that were working there, the docents, were saying that they'd lock up at night, and next morning they'd come in and they'd find like Victorian-era toys that were all in one area, were scattered around the house. One morning they came in and they found that there was a little baby cradle, a doll cradle, and they had a doll in there. The cradle was broken, the doll was like in a different room. Well, it turns out that the doctor that lived there, his wife died in childbirth, giving childbirth to a daughter who survived, and her name was Jessie. And she lived till the age of 3. Then she passed away from either yellow fever or something, or scarlet fever, one of those from that time. So they asked me to do an investigation because they wanted to try to check this out. So I called a person I know from Tampa, Florida, and he met me at the house. The two of us went in there. We met the supervisor there. So there were 3 of us. We spent the entire night in the place. And it was just very quiet. It was actually sort of, unusually quiet. It didn't feel right. There was kind of a quietness that didn't feel correct. But nothing was going on. Nothing happened in the house. So it must have been about 5 o'clock in the morning We finally said, okay, this, we're tired. Nothing's happening. Let's just leave. So the supervisor goes by and she sets all the alarms and everything else. And by doing that, means we have to exit out through the back door, which is through the kitchen. And the kitchen, again, is set up in Victorian style. So there's a wood-burning stove there. And the stove has on its surface a big metal disc. There's an eye bolt attached to it. And attached to that is like this long metal handle, probably 18 inches long, and it probably weighs about a pound. The idea was that when you needed to put more firewood to this hot stove, you would grab that long handle and pull up that lid, drop the wood in, and just slam it down again. So this is a heavy cast iron thing. So the three of us are walking by, and we're ready to head out the door. The door's like 6 feet in front of us. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I detect movement. We had one flashlight. We turned it on there, and what we saw was that long metal rod, that pound rod or heavier, suddenly just lifted up in the air, and it flipped over. It did a 180, and it slammed down on the lid so hard that it really popped off the eye bolt and landed on the floor. The three of us just said, we stood there. We said, "Holy cow!" I mean, we saw this thing. We saw it happen, and it defied all laws of physics. I mean, it was too heavy. We didn't knock it. I mean, we even tried recreating it. Like, well, could we have done this? Could we have knocked it over? No, there was nothing. It just happened instantly and so quickly and so loud and with such force, such violence that, there's no way that we did that. So you get something like that, and you say, well, what was that? The three of us saw it. Of course, as we're heading out the door, our cameras are put away, our recorders are put away. We have nothing but our eyes on this one, but all three of us saw it. We heard it,
It's funny how it happens that way sometimes.
Right. It's almost like they're messing around with you, Well, actually, the supervisor even said, I knew Jessie was here. She's just saying goodbye. I said, yeah, well, maybe.
Yeah.
When something like that happens, it's just, it's amazing. People always say to me, well, what was the scariest place? And I say, well, are we ever too scared? And I said, when something like that happens, it is so unusual and so fascinating that, I don't know about you, but it's not like you think about fear so much as you just stand there in amazement and go, holy cow, look what I just saw,
Right.
Maybe later on, maybe later on in reflection you say, oh, that was kind of creepy, but at the time you're just amazed.
Yeah, that's quite a story. Quite interesting. I've had many experiences myself doing paranormal investigating where, you're just kind of in awe of what has happened. Well, hey, John, we're kind of getting short on time. Talk about where people can find your books, your work, maybe some conferences that you may be speaking at, those sorts of things.
Sure, yeah. Well, my website is johnkachuba.com, JOHNKACHUBA.com, and on there is my schedule of appearances, so anybody can check it out. This time of year especially, I'm all over the place doing library talks, university talks, a couple of conferences, and a lot of this kind of thing, radio and podcasts. But you can get my schedule there. You can also, if you can't find my books in your bookstore, which hopefully you should be able to find them in some of the bookstores anyway, you can get them through my website, or you can get them on Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, Walmart.com. They're not hard to get. They're easy to find. Yeah, I don't have anything coming up conference-wise until I'll be at Scares That Cares in May, and that's in Williamsburg, Virginia. Then I'll be at StokerCon in June in Pittsburgh. That's all my calendar.
All right. Great. Well, hey, John, I really appreciate you spending the time to join me and talk with me. Great discussion, and best of luck in all your future work, and thanks again.